Between 1909 and 1914, something dark settled over the city of Atlanta, Georgia. At first, the deaths were quiet, brushed off as isolated tragedies, women found lifeless in alleyways, behind warehouses, or near train tracks. But patterns began to form. All of the victims were women. Many were black, and almost all were killed in the same brutal, methodical way. The press began to whisper about a predator in the streets, someone the public would soon fearfully nickname the Atlanta Ripper. By the summer of 1911, the body count had reached double digits. Panic spread. Women stopped walking alone. Husbands refused to let their wives out at night. And yet, the killer was never caught. Over a century later, the case remains open, a chilling reminder of justice delayed and perhaps denied. How did a killer hunt so many victims and disappear without a trace? Hit like, subscribe, and let's go. In the early 1910s, Atlanta was a growing southern city, pulsing with industry and opportunity, but divided sharply by race, class, and neighborhood lines. For many working-class black families, daily life meant long shifts in laundries, kitchens, or as domestic workers in white households. One such woman was Belle Walker, a 25-year-old laundress who lived with her parents on Garibaldi Street. Quiet, hardworking, and known for her punctual routine, Belle often walked home alone after finishing her evening shift. Like many others in her community, Belle had dreams, modest ones. A small home of her own someday. Maybe a family. But mostly, she just wanted stability and peace, something so many were still fighting for in post-Reconstruction Georgia. No one could have imagined that Belle would soon become the name in the headlines, her ordinary life suddenly cut short, her story the beginning of something the entire city would come to fear. On the morning of May 28, 1911, Belle Walker didn't come home. Her mother waited by the window, as she always did, expecting the familiar knock at the door. But hours passed and there was only silence. Belle had never been late before. That evening, her body was discovered just a few blocks from her home, throat slashed, her clothes torn, her belongings untouched. The police were quick to respond, but not quick to act. Newspapers ran small stories, noting the unusual violence, but there was no sense of urgency. To some, it was just another tragedy in a rough part of town. Yet among Belle's neighbors, quiet unease began to settle. This didn't feel like a robbery. It didn't feel random. People began locking their doors a little earlier. Mothers walked their daughters to work. No one said it out loud yet, but the sense was growing, something was wrong in Atlanta. Just 2 weeks after Belle Walker's death, another young woman, 27-year-old Addie Watts, was found murdered in almost the same manner, throat slashed, body left near railroad tracks in the Old Fourth Ward. Then came the discovery of Emma Lou Sharp, who managed to escape an attack and tell her story. A tall, well-dressed black man had followed her and suddenly lunged with a blade. She screamed and neighbors rushed out, scaring him off. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Same victim profile, same method, same parts of town. But authorities offered no clear answers and newspapers struggled to agree, some calling the killer a maniac, others dismissing the events as coincidences. Among black Atlantans, however, anxiety turned into quiet fear. Belle's family, still grieving, now faced whispers of a pattern. A killer, maybe? But still, no one in power seemed ready to say it out loud. Not yet. In July 1911, the case took a chilling turn. Within just 1 week, 3 more women were found murdered, each attack more brutal than the last. This time, the public couldn't ignore it. Black community leaders began urging the police to take action, organizing neighborhood patrols when it became clear the city wouldn't protect them. Among them was Reverend Henry Hugh Proctor, a respected minister at the First Congregational Church. He had buried too many young women in the past month. With quiet determination, he began keeping records, interviewing families, and pushing the media to connect the cases. It was Proctor who first used the phrase serial killer, long before it became part of public vocabulary. Families like Belle Walker's found purpose in grief, joining prayer meetings that doubled as information exchanges, sharing details police had overlooked. For the first time, the community wasn't just afraid. It was beginning to push back. By late summer 1911, Reverend Proctor and other community leaders had quietly compiled a disturbing list, over 10 women, all murdered in strikingly similar ways. But what shocked them most wasn't just the number. It was how little the police had done. Reports had gone missing. Witnesses were ignored. And while the black press tried to raise the alarm, most major newspapers buried the story deep inside their pages. Then came a grim discovery. Several of the victims had been seen just hours before their deaths walking near the same streetcar stops or churches. This wasn't random. The killer knew the community, its rhythms, its routines. Proctor felt a new weight settle on his shoulders. Fear, yes, but also anger. How could so many lives be lost with no real effort to stop it? As more funerals were held, a painful truth set in. If justice was going to come, the community might have to find it themselves. In early September 1911, fear turned to fury when the 15th known victim, Sadie Watts, was found murdered just blocks from a schoolyard, broad daylight. Same brutal method. The community erupted. Marches formed. Ministers, including Reverend Proctor, demanded answers at city council meetings. But the police response was chilling, a vague promise of investigating and an arrest of a man with no clear ties to any of the crimes, possibly just to calm public outcry. Proctor faced a painful decision. If he kept pressing, he risked backlash not just from authorities, but from those who feared making the situation worse. But silence meant surrender. He chose to speak louder, calling on churches, journalists, and even out-of-town activists to expose what was happening in Atlanta. Still, the killer remained nameless, faceless, walking free. And the question hung in the air like smoke: would anyone be next, and if so, who? What would you have done in their place? By the end of 1911, public fear gave way to exhaustion. The murders slowed, but they didn't stop. The community was drained, grief piling on top of fear with no justice in sight. Reverend Proctor, once so full of conviction, watched as city officials shifted their focus elsewhere, eager to close the chapter without solving the mystery. Then came the deepest blow. A young woman from his own congregation, Rosa Rivers, was found murdered in the same horrific manner. It hit close, too close. Proctor felt he had failed, not just as a leader, but as a protector. The streets felt colder, trust thinner, hope distant. But even in that darkness, something held. More churches joined the cause. Black newspapers across the South picked up the story. People were still afraid, but they were no longer silent. And sometimes that's where change begins. Would it be enough? By early 1912, the murders had nearly stopped, but not because the killer was caught. No trial was ever held. No confession ever came. Yet something had shifted. Thanks to pressure from black clergy, journalists, and families, the city was forced to increase patrols in affected neighborhoods. Churches organized escort groups for women walking home from work. And community members, once isolated by fear, found strength in unity. Reverend Proctor came to understand a difficult truth: they might never know who the Atlanta Ripper really was. But that didn't mean their efforts were wasted. Lives were still being protected. Voices, once ignored, were finally being heard. The wounds remained, but so did the will to keep each other safe. In a city that hadn't protected them, they learned how to protect themselves. Sometimes justice isn't a name, it's a refusal to be forgotten. Years later, Reverend Henry Proctor continued his work in Atlanta, preaching, organizing, and quietly honoring the women whose lives were taken. He rarely spoke about the murders publicly, but those who knew him could see the weight he still carried. The church archives held his handwritten notes, names, dates, locations, proof that someone had paid attention even when the system had not. For the city, the Atlanta Ripper faded into history, a cold case buried under newer headlines. But for families and communities once gripped by fear, the memory remained sharp. The loss didn't vanish. It simply became part of how they moved forward, more cautious, more connected, and more aware of how easily some lives are overlooked. More than a century has passed, and no one was ever held accountable. So here's the question: if something like this happened in your city today, would anyone listen soon enough? Let us know what you think in the comments.